event for the museums group, and tonight we've got, as I said, some fantastic speakers. We're looking at using Agile for an individual growth mindset. They'll be talking with a sort of in conversation style event, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end of the event. So any questions you want to send to the panel, please put straight into the chat, and we'll monitor those and we'll ask them at the end of the event. But please, throughout the event, just drop all your questions in the chat. Before I get to the panel, I just want to ask you a few questions. In fact, as a museums group, we want to get to know you. So we've got a few questions we've put together for slido.com. You can see on your screen, there's a QR code you can scan to use via your phone. There should be a web link going into the chat in a second, or it might already be there, I'm not sure. If you head to that link, if you've had a second to do that, we want to just gather some quick information from you to help shape tonight's session and give a little bit more information to the speakers about who's in the audience. So firstly, if you could pick 3 words to describe what you're hoping to get out of today's session, that will be very helpful to us to kind of steer some of the discussion a little. So what are you really hoping to get out of tonight? What kind of things are you interested in? And I can already see someone's looking for ideas and inspiration, which is hopefully what we'll provide. Ideally, that's what we're all about, is some good ideas and things coming out of these kind of sessions. I'm just going to actually just really briefly talk on networking. Networking is a really interesting one. It's been a big part of what the London Museums Group has done for quite a long time. It's been incredibly hard to do networking via Zoom. It's something we're really looking into how we can do for the next set of events that we're hopefully going to do later in 2021. But it's such an important thing, and it's a really important thing what the Museums Group does. Okay, thank you for responses there. We'll move on to the next question, which is what type of museum do you work in? And this helps us to kind of get an idea again, who's in the audience, what sort of level, I guess, some of the ideas we might want to put forward are, because as I'm sure you're all aware, if you're working a big national museum, it's sometimes really hard to get ideas through, or maybe, you know, you're in a really small museum and you've got no budget at all. So it's a really useful way to look at this discussion, how we can steer it. I can already see independent museums, local authorities are very well represented today, so that's very useful. Okay, and we'll just go to our final question quickly. And this is for the future of our webinars. As I mentioned, this is the last in our series. So what topics do you want to see us cover in the future? Hopefully, as I say, we'll be doing another set of events later in the year. What kind of things do we need to be doing to get the membership informed and upskilled and interested, and all of that kind of fun stuff? Let's give it another few seconds to do that. Okay. Fantastic. Okay, we'll keep those coming in as we sort of move on in our slides. You can still sort of add your comments in there, and we'll collect them all at the end, and that will help us shape our future program. So thank you very much. And we are now ready to kind of start the event proper. So I want to introduce you to our speakers tonight. We have Francis Jeens from the Jewish Museum, and we have Etienne Joseph from Hackney Archives. So I'll ask them each to introduce themselves briefly, talk a little about who they are, the work they're doing, before we really get on to tonight's theme and conversation. So let's start with Francis. Could you give us a little hello and an introduction to yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So I'm Fran. I am the current interim museum director at the Jewish Museum London, which is a small independent museum in Camden Town. Previous to stepping up to my current role, which I did last April, unbelievably almost a year ago, I was the director of learning and engagement there. So my work was all about forming partnerships and working with communities and partners both within our Jewish community and the non-Jewish communities and our local community as well. So this past year, I have been responsible for the museum's strategic direction. We implemented a new model called the engagement model, which saw us through this financial year that's just ending. And it's a 2-year model. And the year that we're just about to go into is known as the partnership model year. So this is a huge topic for us at the moment. So looking forward to sharing what we've been doing.
Excellent, thank you. And Etienne, I should say Dr.
Hi.
Etienne. Apologies.
No,
I've dropped
don't
your
say
doctor.
doctor. It's
That's
all
rude
right.
of
I
me.
was wondering. Yeah, the doctor's got on there. It doesn't have to be. It's quite fine. Yeah. So hi everybody. My name is Etienne Joseph. I'm the archives manager at Hackney Archives, which is, I guess, a medium-sized local authority archives. Thanks for letting me on, because I know it's a museum's call. So thanks, Joe. We've got 3.5 staff, which are 2 archives officers and a local studies and archives assistant, and then me, the manager. And from time to time, we've got some project staff as well. So this is a topic, it's kind of an emerging topic for us. So basically, Hackney Museum for some years has been, doing some really good work. And the archives, not this, they had strengths in different places, but I think there's been a drive over the past few years to kind of start moving more into being much more outward facing and just being a lot more collaborative in our approach. I only joined the service 3 and a bit years ago. My background, I mean, I've worked in other archives, but my background's actually in the arts and done a lot of kind of community and arts work. So I'm sort of coming from the other side in a way. So bringing some of that thinking into this position now. And we're sort of in a very early stages. So whereas Fran was just talking about kind of strategic direction and kind of setting all of that setting up, we're sort of almost a little bit before that. We're kind of experimenting, and then from those experiments are going to kind of develop a little bit more of a strategy around engagement. And as I say, fortunately, because of Hackney Museum and that relationship, we've some of that thinking's there already just from their work, but we're kind of, devising some for ourselves. So yeah, that's probably about it for now.
Excellent. That's good to hear. And I just want to speak to your concern about being an archives person in museum call. It's great. The whole thing we want to do is learn from different approaches and sectors. So I think you're going to be able to give us some really great examples, especially when it comes to, the experimentation. It's something I think a lot of people on the call probably agree with. We don't probably do enough of in museums. We're quite often a bit too conservative, a bit too afraid to fail. So I think there'll be some very interesting things that come out through that. So tonight our theme is fostering collaborative practice through co-creation. I'd like to start, let's start with Etienne, as you've kind of already started about that experimentation kind of side you're going through. What do you think the key principles are for cultural organizations when you start beginning and starting to work in a collaborative manner?
Unmute, that's a good start, isn't it? I think firstly, this sounds like a contradiction, but hopefully it isn't. It's about knowing your aims, but at the same time being prepared to be flexible and changing some of those things along the way. And so for us, one of the things, the two, I talked about engagement and wanting to be a bit more outward facing, but then also thinking about our collections as against the sort of demographic where we're operating in Hackney. The collections aren't necessarily representative of the people that we're serving, although there's elements, but I think there's a lot of gaps. So for us, one of the key aims is just thinking about how those collections can be made more representative, and that's really through linking up with people and collaborating and forging those relationships. So that's our aim, but then we found that along the way you need to really be flexible about what those mean, and how you kind of progress those. Knowing your strengths, I talked about a collection. We've got some collection strengths, but our collection is sort of our strength and our weakness. There's some really interesting key collections, but then outside of that, there's probably there's a big gap where there should be more. So about knowing our collections quite well, and knowing who would be interested in what, and then but also where the gaps are around that. Being honest about weaknesses as well, and that's just being very clear about what you can't do so well or don't do so well, and how you can kind of address that. And that's what we found in terms of our partnerships. Partnerships are all about, have been for us, about kind of helping us, or the things we can't do, working with people that can do them, and vice versa. So we're kind of both filling each other's needs a little bit. So yeah, there's some initial thoughts that I've got on that.
Excellent. And Fran, what do you, what from your perspective, do you think is the most important principles, especially as you head into this partnership section of the new model you're working on? What's the main kind of principles you're putting through that as you start collaboratively working more?
I mean, first of all, I agree with everything Etienne said. I think all of these things are so important. I think for us, what has been sort of a guiding principle, and something we've really focused down on in this past year and going to the next, is really understanding what partnerships are. to us and to other people. And we've sort of honed down this definition for ourselves about, I think we often use the word partnership to mean like a whole myriad of different things. So what we're trying to be is more specific with the language that we're using to help us do all those things that Etienne was saying, like starting on the right footing and making sure that we're value adding and that we know where we can help and where others are best suited. So we think of partnerships as the relationship. So you can have partners with lots and lots of people. You can have partnerships with 100 different people because they're relationships that you're building. But then we have different types of practice. So we might have something like cooperative practice that might be something which is really short term and is, you know, sort of quite easy for both of us doing, is very low risk. And then we might have a step up from that, something which is more about cooperation, which is doing something shared together and is slightly more formal. And then post that we have collaborative, which is long term. It's about changing what we're doing. It's more transformational than transactional, I suppose. So for us, this like key principle has always been this thinking about we have our partners, like their partnerships, their relationships we have within the community, but what is it we want to do with those partnerships and how we think about that going forward. So I'd say that's probably the only thing I would add on, really.
I think one really interesting thing you kind of touched on there is like partnerships are relationships. And I think, you know, we get a bit buzzwordy, obviously, in museums, and particularly when it comes to things like funding and all that kind of stuff. Partnerships will be this big buzzword, essentially, that just sits there. And I'll say, you need to be doing partnership work and all of that. And there isn't that breakdown sometimes. And I think maybe it can be over-awing, I guess, for sometimes people approaching that. And I think the idea of really breaking that down, viewing it as relationships, because when you start to think, you know, this is more of a long-term thing, this is more of a transactional thing, you're starting to create relationships that help you actually forge better relationships in other areas and all of that kind of thing. I mean, is there a good example maybe that you I guess, pull out of how you've been using those different relationships to work in a kind of holistic way towards a bigger goal?
Yeah, and I think there's a few, and I think also there's it's interesting because within a partnership you can have several of those different types going at different times as well, and there's not really a hierarchy of preference for them. I think, you know, if we take a potentially sort of a past example that we're carrying through, so we started a relationship, a partnership with an organization called Jamie, which is a Jewish mental health charity, about 3 years ago. And the first part of that was very transactional. They came in and they did training for us and taught us how to be mental health first aiders. And we trained up about 80% of the staff. And we didn't really know where that was going to go afterwards. It was a very sort of like a one-time sort of feeling. And then over the past 3 years, we've done various different projects together. So we have done work with young people about the mental health of being a legacy bearer of the Holocaust, and working with young people who are taking on that responsibility as survivors are less able to. And they helped us design the program. They came with us to the workshops and they brought their own staff, and that became much more transformational. It changed the way that we did our programming. We're now we're just in the process of just starting to design a new program about grief and loss, and working with young people who've experienced that for the very first time. And we're using our skills of working with Holocaust education and the complexity of that subject about grief and loss. And then we're building in their skills, and they're recommending working with grief counselors external to them as well. So they're building up our networks and building up our relationships outside of that as well, and bringing new people in. I think that's one really good example. There are plenty, and I'm happy to go into potentially more. Maybe I'll keep a few back for other questions. But I think there are lots of examples where a relationship is started in one way, and then, like all personal relationships, as you trust each other and you grow confidence and you prove that you are delivering your end, and that you can work together in a really nice way, you know, in a way that feels very natural, you tend to build up to these more transformational types of things. I think where it's failed in the past for us, or failed in the past, is where you've tried to go straight into that transformational partnership change, even though you don't really know each other all that well.
Yeah, and Etienne, is that something you found as you sort of go on this, you know, as you describe, sort of experience, kind of where you're exploring different options and trying to, like, you know, find your path into this? Is this something you've encountered, that have you started too quickly in some cases, or have you found that relationships you've initially done to get training or something transactional have developed over time and become quite core to what you're doing?
Totally. I think a project that started off not being a project, which has turned into something quite transformational, that we're working on at the moment, is totally that. Like it was literally, there was some young people that were working for a group called Hackney Account, which is an independent advisory group to the police there, and they were kind of looking at policing in the area and how it affected them. And they came in, I think initially it was at Hackney Museum, and I was just invited to the sessions because I had an interest in some of the collections. And that was it was sort of a one-off thing just to introduce them to some material, and that was sort of supposed to be it. But then that's grown. That was sort of 3 years ago now, and that's grown into more workshops. And then at that point, it still wasn't necessarily a project. And then at some point, it became a project where they decided they wanted to make a film and then run some events around it. But it was about so I don't know if they knew that they were sort of transforming our practice internally, but they were. And then at the same time, I think that whole kind of building of trust, like I've worked on quite a few projects that what Fran just described, where you kind of, people seem to fit the bill, and you find some money to do something, and but then you still need to go through that process of getting to know each other, and it doesn't always work out. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But I think starting quite small and transactional and moving up has really, I think I'd like to work that way in the future. So in terms of our experimentation, that's been a really positive outcome. Is that, okay, we'd like to do that more. But things don't always come in that package, but maybe we'll come to that later. So
I think that's something that is a very useful sort of transferable concept as well, because we've already seen from people writing in at the start that a lot of independent museums, a lot of small museums will be represented here. That's a feasible thing to do. Start small and kind of build from there. And I think the idea of a project that wasn't a project, that's kind of, in a way, that's the promised land. You know that your partnership is really strong if the museum or the archives or whoever isn't the one directing it. It's someone who you're working with coming to you and going, this is something we could do. This is how we want to take control and how we want to work with you. And I think that really shows how that partnership might develop and brings a completely different aspect to the work that you'd be doing. I was quite interested in something else you said, Etienne, about your collections not being representative of the people, of your audience. And is this something that you kind of work towards meeting by kind of starting small and growing that trust over time?
It is, but I think I was just, as you were talking there, and sort of the end of my last answer, the word integrity popped into my mind around building things in that way. And I think in the same way with collections development, I mean, we are starting to see changes now. We took on a huge collection during lockdown, which was quite an interesting experience, probably for another time. But we are starting to see real changes. But that's, I think, because of demonstrating integrity, and not just being like, okay, we need to tick this box, let's apply to this, and can you do this, and here we are, it's ticked. It's I think it's been a process of sort of showing that that's not how we work in a way, but it is bearing fruit. And it's a weird contradiction, because I think I said at the beginning that is part of our aim, but if that's like front and center, then it's sort of it can almost harm you in a way. You kind of need to be aware of it, but also work through the process as well. So.
Yeah, and I think that's what brings the trust in, isn't it? Being seen to be honest and open and having that integrity is why your audience will start to trust you and start to build that bridge with you. I just want to take this opportunity to remind everyone, if you've got questions for the panel, drop them straight into the chat and we'll be able to come to those at the end, which is a great sort of link towards our next thing to talk about, which is communication. We're talking about integrity, we're talking about building that trust. Francis, how are you communicating with your community to try to cross those bridges?
It's been like a real huge part of this past year. This was a huge focus for us, and we did think about this quite a lot. One of the very first things we did actually was think about how communication happened within the staff. So one of the very, very first things we did right at the beginning was thinking about who already has partnerships and relationships like with all of these community groups. We have a staff who are working on so many projects and have built up these relationships and many of them for many years. So we actually did a whole collation process where everyone wrote down every single community partner that they had, that they had worked with, whether that was 5 years ago and they haven't talked to them since, or people we've been working with the whole way through. And we ended up with this huge list that we could then go through, and we could start thinking, okay, well, how does it work when 3 years ago we were doing this one project with them that was project funded, came to an end. Did anyone pick that up? Have we kept up that relationship? Oh, you know, and then we saw actually 3 years later, there was this other little thing that got picked up by another member of staff because it was curatorial rather than learning or whatever it was. And so one of the first things we actually decided to do was and this will be something we're going to start implementing from this year, is we're going to try a whole new model of having sort of like a relationship manager. So we're going to have this idea of there are only so many relationships you can, like, I think personal or in your organization, like maintain all the time and keep in contact, keep up to date and all the rest. So we're going to sort of set aside a set number and say, look, these are the relationships we think we can manage. And, you know, realistically, can every staff member manage 3 good relationships, you know, across a year? That feels manageable. And then what we'll do from that is that staff member becomes the relationship manager. And that's very much an internal thing. It's not something we're saying to our partners in that sort of way, but it's a way that any project that involves that partner in any way, that person will know about it. And it means that there's always this like central idea of you understand what you're asking that partner to do. So again, it becomes this less transactional idea of, oh, we need someone to donate an object because it's, you know, the topic of the month, or, you know, we need someone to do a reinterpretation online through a digital event. It's actually, let's look at how we're working with this partner long term and make sure there's some sort of flow to that relationship. So I think when we're trying to communicate with our community partners in particular, that is going to be like a bit of a shift for us in how we think about working. But like I said, we're literally just about to start that. So a year from now, I might be able to tell you how it's worked in practice. But I think it's something we definitely want to try.
I think, you know, from my own sort of experience of partnership working, that will probably kind of get rid of one of the big blocks around partnership working, which is relationships disappearing when staff members move on. You know, and that's one of the biggest problems, that relationships get dropped. And, you know, within the sector, obviously people are moving through jobs, especially in kind of engagement roles, every couple of years. And you know, that idea of an audit, what are you doing across the organization, and how can you know, focus all of those things into one place? That will, you know, in years, I think in years to come, prove absolutely brilliant, you know, and it will pay dividends hopefully, and mean you don't lose those relationships. Etienne, is that something that, you know, is that an approach that Hackney might look at? Because I guess one of the big challenges you have is you're covering a large geographic area which is disparate in the communities you might be engaging with.
No, it was communication, particularly during this time, has been a real challenge for sort of a number of reasons. I think one, because we're primarily an archive service, and we've been sort of, although we've been close to the public for lengths of time, we've been open and doing kind of lots of remote inquiries work and stuff. So that basically we've got a sort of functioning service all the way through lockdown. But then in some respects, it's also been harder because some of our communication, I mean, you know, with various means, sort of social media and email, phone, all sorts of things, but some of it did actually rely on sort of person-to-person contacts and just being in the area and being visible. And so with that taken away, it's actually been quite a challenge. So yeah,
and I imagine that's such a core part for both of you. You know, you've got very distinct areas that you're sort of serving, very distinct communities, and that sort of, you know, showing you're still there, showing you care. Is that something you've kind of had issues with, Fran? You know, during the lockdown particularly, have you been able to, you know, with the Jewish Museum going through such a sort of a change in general, is that something you've been able to do? Have there been any problems or challenges?
I mean, there's definitely been challenges. I think I echo a lot of what Etienne said about you know, a lot of relationship building is and also, you know, partners come in so many forms. They're stakeholders, they're you know, they're community partners, they're funders, they're, you know, all these sort of different ones, and a lot of them take a lot of personal relationship building, which is often really, you know, it's hard to sort of quantify, and it does take sort of a different aspect of your life in a different way. But I mean, yeah, there have definitely been challenges. I think. What was the first part of your question, Joe? I've immediately forgotten the first part of your question as I went to go think about something completely different. What were you asking me?
I was sort of more thinking about like the challenges that might come up, particularly in lockdown, to sort of serve the community and show how you care and you're there and you're not just disappearing off.
Yeah, so I think what we did was right at the beginning of lockdown, we knew we were going to be, we're only we're a small team, and we're a team of 11 with part-time and full-time, and we knew that we were not going to be able to sustain everything, get all of our partnerships and all of our, I mean, it's just not possible, and things did have to give. And we selected key partnerships and core work. So for example, our work with schools was an absolute priority. So our partnerships with core schools who come back every time, who we've invested huge amounts of time getting to know the teachers and the head teachers and all the rest, that was an absolute priority. So we invested a huge amount of our staff time in maintaining those relationships. Things like Jamie and the mental health, we knew was going to be core. But we also had to recognize when actually we weren't potentially the right people to be speaking up and looking for partnerships. You know, there's an organization within the Jewish community called Jewish Care, which run a lot of our care homes and nursing homes. Usually we do a lot of work with them because we do our dementia outreach program, but we had to just take a step back and say they are frontline workers doing a huge amount of work. You know, us asking for them to be in partnership, whatever that was, whether that was, you know, collecting items, you know, that were contemporary about what was happening, or, you know, wanting them to be involved and inviting them in as respite care, it just wasn't the right time. You know, that relationship will pick up again. I think a good part of being in a good relationship and collaborative relationship is understanding when it's good to ask, and like when it's good to say, I can see that you're super busy. Now is not the right time to be asking each other to do things. And I think that was a bit of a learning curve right at the beginning, because it was just, I mean, we all felt it. This just like overriding us to like, you know, this enormous thing was happening in our communities. How do we document it? How do we be involved in it? How do we, you know, show our value within it? But it's also about saying, okay, wait a minute, there are places we are really supportive, and there are places where actually we are observers at the moment, and then we will come back into that.
Is there any kind of feedback you've had from the community about your approach? Is there, you know, anyone that said it's great that you kind of stood back and took that observer role? Is there anyone that said, you know, we really, you know, needed you to be there on the doorstep and you weren't able to be, or you were and it was amazing? Have you got that kind of feedback yet?
Yeah, we had some good feedback, particularly from stakeholders who I think the community was really hard hit. So the Jewish community is an ethnic minority, and they were hard hit, like a lot of minority ethnic communities were, by COVID. So the community went into shock really quite early about the amount of loss, the amount of medical care that was required. And I think we got a lot of feedback straight on that it was the right thing, that there was sort of a staggered approach within the community, and that we did hold back and we said this is not the right time for us to do things. And I think what was challenging for us is that we wanted to show our value. You know, all of charities had to show immediately their value, like why we exist, our purpose, our core value, all of these things. And it was extremely tempting to immediately want to go out and do those things. But we did have to hold it back. And I think at the time, it was really questioned, you know, like, is this the right approach? We saw other museums doing all this amazing work, and it was really, really tempting. But I think long term, it has worked better. You know, that our partners have definitely appreciated it, and the way that we're working with them now, I think sometimes it is just about keeping an eye on sort of the long termness and the long term aims you want out of your partnerships. And it did involve holding our nerve a bit, but I think it was the right approach for us. Yeah.
And I think there's an element of reality that also has to come into that. You know, we both direct relatively small teams at museums, and you know the team might have been furloughed. You know, you've got less capacity. You've got to think in survival mode.
Yeah.
How do you feel that, you know, that might have affected the way you approach partnerships? Was some of it kind of, you know, you just don't have the capacity to deliver it, and that's where that prioritization came in?
Yeah, a lot of it was, we did do a prioritization of, you know, what absolutely has to be, well, first of all was what absolutely has to be delivered. You know, you either have funding in place for it, or, you know, whatever it was. And the second part of that, okay, we can only choose a certain number of things. Like, what is it that we care most about? What is it that we don't want to lose? And, you know, we selected those things, and then we said, right, that's going to be the core of what it is. And, you know, we're not running 100% of programming, and, you know, that's going to be a slow build back up for us. But we wanted to choose a few things and do them really well, because whilst we can maintain all those relationships, we don't have to be collaboratively working together. We can still maintain them all. And I would rather do a really good job with a handful, so that when they talk to the other people in the community, they can say, we did this amazing thing, it was really worth it. It's about that sort of informal networking that goes on with your partners as well, because they're all working together in different ways all the time as well. So you want that feedback back into the community, which isn't coming direct from you. They're talking to each other about what a great experience they had. And I think we would rather do that than try and stretch ourselves. I mean, we all feel stretched all the time, but I think if we stretch ourselves any further than that, I think it started to feel like this is becoming hard work rather than something beneficial. And I think partnerships at their core should be beneficial to everyone. So I think we definitely kept on that side of it.
I think that's a really good way to kind of frame it, and it kind of comes back to, that idea we're talking about, it's a holistic way to look at it, is you're not them making partnerships, you are a partner to lots of people in the same way they're partners to you. So what is the best way to be part of that group? And some of them work together, some of the bits and pieces you might work on with them, they're all kind of equal, they all build towards a bigger whole, I guess. I think one thing that kind of comes through and that really speaks to the theme of the webinars we've been working on over the last few months is that kind of idea about agile, which is sort of moving quickly, making quick decisions, but changing them very quickly if you needed to, and thinking about those principles to shape how you're working. Etienne, I want to come to you because it's something really interesting that we talked about a little before this event, which was about kind of agile as a principle. And you're sort of saying you did a whole load of work, the whole approach to the archives and the approach to the community engagement, the approach to the partnership working, and then you realize you started to use agile principles and you'd not really thought about it, but they were underpinning the work you'd been doing. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about how some of those things started to seep through and were useful.
Totally. I mean, to be honest, I didn't even really know what Agile was too much. We were just doing, but then in other projects in the council for something completely different around records management, started to use Agile as a methodology there. And I was like, oh, hang on, this is what we've been doing, but didn't really realize. And I think the real power of it is about doing a little bit and then sort of standing back and saying, okay, how is this working? Is this not working? How could this work better? Or what needs to be done next? And then sort of, I guess, chunking up the work. And then over time, it sort of builds into something quite, well, in this case, for us, fortunately, it has built into something that we're quite proud of. But it's happened through sort of lots of little interactions that have sort of grown. And as I said, as a result, that's kind of really, it's sort of transformed how we think about projects. I think when I first started working in heritage and even the arts before that, there's this sort of thinking of, okay, we've got this thing that we want to do, or maybe someone else has said that they want to do. Let's go and find some funds in order to do that thing. And then if you're fortunate, you do it, you get the funds and you do the thing. And then sometimes it can be actually quite hard to keep those partnerships going beyond that. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And this, I think, our experience over the past couple of years has just been, it's just changed our way to our thinking around how we approach projects. But then, as I sort of referred to before, I think sometimes that the model that I just described, that I said that we're not doing so much now, sometimes that is totally appropriate depending on what the thing is you're trying to do. So it's not like we're totally ruling out working in any other way, but those kind of agile principles and sort of doing a little bit, reviewing, tweaking, carrying on, have been definitely changed how we think about our approach.
Just before we sort of continue on, I just want to remind everyone we'll be doing the Q&A in sort of 5-10 minutes. So if you've got any questions for the panel, please drop them into the chat. And just again, Etienne, you're talking about how he didn't think about those principles initially, but then they sort of filtered through to the work. Is that something you do differently? Would you start with a methodology, or would you think it would be a better approach to actually just start doing things and see what kind of comes out of it? Or is there anything else you'd have done differently?
I don't know. I think it's about weighing up things sort of as what the situation demands at the time, but just having it as a tool, having it as one potential way to work, and then seeing what the situation is really calling for. So I think there's a project that we're just about to get involved in with the Vietnamese community in Hackney, and it's a time limited project. There's some and it's the approach that I've just described wouldn't work. It's like for what we need to do for that. So it's like, okay, that's not the tool for this job, but then it is for others. So it's kind of about having a clear idea of what the situation demands, but then also knowing what's in your toolbox. So I think Agile wasn't in our toolbox before. At least I didn't know it was, but it kind of is now. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say.
And Fran, is there anything you sort of think you'd do differently if you had to, approach a lot of this partnership working? If you're a year into the new strategy, is there anything you think you'd do different if you went back a year?
That's a good question. I think, I mean, it's interesting for us because I think we are still in this sort of formation of what's going to work for us and testing and modeling as we go. And I think, I think probably if I was going to give myself a a year ago when we were starting to think about sort of partners for this year, because we tend to reevaluate every year, and we have we developed a partnership matrix which sort of shows what our priorities are for the year, what sort of projects are going to be going off the year that we can then show to our partners and say, are there things on this list that you'd like to get involved with, and if so, then we can start planning those across the year. And I think one of the things I'd probably go back and give myself advice for is, I think one of the most challenging things to relationships is instability, not knowing whether things are going to happen, or what there's going to be change, if staff are going to be there, and all these sorts of things. And I think again, like the pace of everything with this past year, and this like desire to be really active, which we really have been, and so many museums have done phenomenal work, but I think we potentially, I'd say, like for myself and potentially even other museums I've talked to as well, there was almost this intermittent sort of year that we've had where people were here, people weren't here, projects were active, projects were, it's very unstable for partnerships, and can take you back a few steps. And I think so the advice that I'm sort of giving myself now is just giving ourselves time as we start to come back in to say, there is a little bit of rebuilding to do. And it's kind of like what Etienne was saying about bringing people back in, and you haven't been able to meet them in person, and usually you do a lot of this work in this sort of way. And I think there's definitely going to be this sort of next stage to our partnerships, which is about coming back together in a physical way, which I think is going to be really important.
Fantastic. And just before we move to Q&A, there's one kind of other comment it'd be great to hear from you both on, which is the kind of thought, can anyone do this? I think the more you talk about things like relationship management and partnership working, it can become almost overawing. It can be scary, because I think a lot of people within the museum sector would not think of themselves as an extrovert and assume that to be a relationship manager, to be a partnership person, you need to be that extra. You need to be the person who goes out to every networking event or whatever. What advice would you give to other museum professionals, especially if they were initially not confident about doing this? If you were looking to build a new relationship, what key advice, let's start with Fran, would you give to other museum professionals looking to start new relationship working?
I'd say maybe start like how we did, actually, like just even if it's just yourself, like writing down all the relationships you already have. I think it was really eye-opening. Like we never really thought about it in that way. And when we started writing it down, everybody's got relationships with community partners and people you've worked with, and you're doing a lot of that already. You're just thinking about it in a very informal way. And actually, not a lot that has to change. I think the language that they're using is, like a lot of the times in the museum sector, it's very internal language, like it's the way that we're framing it. But, it hasn't changed our approach to how we talk to our partners and the way that we collaborate. It's just about thinking about in-house how we're managing that. And some of it's really easy as well, thinking about, when you're working on a project with, I say a partner organization, are you storing that in a separate project file that's specific to, say, that NLHF funding, or are you thinking, oh, is there a file on our on our server that has every work we've ever done with this partner, so you can see like all those relationships being built up and all that work that's been done. I think there are some like really quick wins that help you sort of manage a relationship, and one of the things that we're thinking about is we have a CRM called Razor's Edge, which I'm sure lots of museums also use, which is about keeping profiles of various people involved. We're thinking, what was if we use that for partners? What was if we had partnership profiles and we talked about the things that we did in there, and we mentioned the stuff? I think you don't have to change the way you work. A lot of what people do is already doing this. I think it's just about stepping back and looking at it in this sort of light and saying, actually, if we want to think about it as long-term relationships, how do we manage them a little bit differently?
And Etienne, what advice would you give to other professionals?
I think Fran's stolen my thunder, because that's pretty much what I was going to say. I think we're already doing it. Basically, most people are already doing it, but it's just maybe being a bit more reflective about doing it, and then maybe a little bit more deliberate about kind of actioning certain things. But I think we are already doing it. I would say though that I think it's really important that the team, because I suppose I'm thinking particularly about community partners here, but I think people pick up really quickly if you are box ticking and if you are not necessarily that interested. So I think it's really important that the team you have is interested in doing that particular piece of work and is kind of invested in it, because that's just something that I've found. I think it's pretty vital to a good partnership, that kind of sense that, okay, these people actually really care about this thing. Yeah, so that's the only thing I'd add. But I think Fran's totally right. I mean, we're all doing it already, but just maybe need to think about it a bit more, reflect on it a little bit more.
I think one thing I'll just add to that is that you're so right that people can see right through you if you're box ticking. But one of the key things I think people might want to think about is that you might need to sell upwards in your organization, that you need to have proper chats, and it will take longer than people might want. Because in a lot of cases, you might have someone with, I don't know, a National Lottery Heritage Fund project, and they go, well, in a year's time, we need to have these relationships with the people on the estate next door. Sometimes you need to be the person that goes, well, if you want to do it properly, you need to give that 3 years or give a different target in a year, because it's not feasible. Because a big part of partnership working, if you want to do it properly, is to make sure it's embedded and long-term, mutually beneficial. And if you're box ticking, the people that you want to build those relationships with, for your funding or your future museum or whatever, they will not work with you. They will walk away and they will not be interested.
I've been really fortunate in that the sort of levels above me in my organization really understand it, and then maybe I'm not sure about all the way to the top, but enough that that those conversations are had, because I think that you're right, that is crucial. So yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on to a Q&A. We've had some good questions in the chat. If you've got any further questions in the audience, please do drop them in the chat for the panel. I'll also just note that we've got some links in there about Agile principles and some other bits and pieces, which might be of interest and useful if you've found them interesting during the chat. So the first question we've got is from Megan. How much do you seek your partners? How much do you react to approaches? So Fran, let's start with you. How do you kind of go about it? Do you go out looking for people to work with, or do you wait until people come to you?
I suppose a little bit both. I think we definitely, I think if this year has taught us nothing, it's flexible is the word of 21, isn't it? I think it's this, we definitely have this sort of flexible approach, and you do have to be adaptive but not reactive, I suppose, to the environment. And I think one of the things that we have in place, or we're putting in place, is this partnership matrix that I've sort of referred to. So what it is it's a document that lays out our values on sort of one half of the page, our key projects that are coming up, and the ways that we want to work together. And then the second half of the page is what the partner then fills out, and they say, these are the sorts of things that are our values, these are our priorities for the year, these are the sorts of projects we've got going on. What we're hoping is that that's actually going to, and we've tried it a couple of times as in a pilot, is it's about taking that step back. And when people come to you and they say, we want a partnership, and you say, what does that mean? Do you want us to do an event with you? That's a very transactional sort of idea, but absolutely, let's build a relationship, let's start there. Or we can't, we've got so much capacity, this just isn't, we're not looking for a new transactional relationship, or this partner is potentially, that community is covered through another partnership we already have, and therefore we've only got so many people and so much time, and we have to prioritize. But it also helps us maintain the longer term relationships by keeping it fresh, by saying, this is what we're focusing on this year. Is this still what you're focusing on? Is it still a good one to take forward into next year? Or should we take a bit of a rest and move it, and then we'll revisit it next year? And it feels then that we've got momentum to keep in touch with everybody, but we're not, I suppose it's like all things, it's much easier to say no to somebody if you feel you've got some criteria behind you of why you're saying yes and why you're saying no. Otherwise, if people come to you and they say we want to do something together, and you say, well, I don't want to, it can feel a little bit, that's a bit of a relationship stop. So for us, it's just about, okay, well then how can we look at this together and come to the same conclusion that potentially this isn't right, but hey, I can recommend you to someone else who might be a really good partnership broker for you for this time, and then come back and we'll talk about it next year. So that's how we're approaching it. Yeah.
And Etienne, how about on your end? Is it something, do you approach people more, or do you wait for them to come to you?
I think a bit of both. I think good projects have come out of both, and sometimes a combination of both as well. I think having some element of reach out is important. Even if somebody's connected with you, then sometimes then even that will develop, and you'll have to reach a bit further to kind of grow that. So yeah, but both, and similar to what Fran was talking about, maybe not as formalized. We don't have a matrix, but we do have kind of values and priorities, and just seeing how they match up, and then yeah, kind of work or not work on that basis. But I think when I'm thinking about the past 2 or 3 years, it's sort of been a combination of some people who approached us, and the values have aligned, and I think and then there's some things that I've or other members of the team have reached out and have sort of grown something, and then that then has generated other approaches that are sort of in line with those values, so then it kind of grows in that way. So yeah, bit of both.
Excellent. So the next question is from Lorna. Have you been building new collaborative relationships with audiences? And she's specifically asking about how that works online. So I think she must mean sort of within the last year where everything's been shut down. We've only been able to get in touch with people via social media or newsletters or whatever it may be. Etienne, is that something that you've been doing, trying to build new relationships, or have you just kind of been keeping it level?
Well, based on what I said before about capacity, not really. We've been trying, I mean, I think in a sort of very general way, just trying to build a bit more of an audience using social media and that kind of thing. But I think in a specific partnership working way, it's been more about maintaining existing partnerships and kind of growing those in spite of the lockdown rather than sort of embarking on a new piece of work. Not to say that we wouldn't, because I think, you know, if the right thing came along, then we definitely we'd look at it. But we have probably been extending a little bit less during this time just because of capacity. Because I think it would be a bit of an injustice to the partnerships we already have, because then we'd just all be a bit too stretched, I think.
And Fran, is it something you've put on hold, or are you still looking to build during this year?
We've actually done a bit of a focus on building, but that was potentially because of where we were to begin with, I think, and it's been such a focus for us about this sort of broadening out into the community. And right back to what Etienne was saying at the beginning about our collection not representing the community in the way that we want it to. So it has been like a huge focus for us. But saying that, we have kept the partnerships that we have begun, or like the relationship that we're starting, to be on that lower end of the scale where they're sort of cooperative, or, you know, moving towards cooperative and sort of coordinated. So that's sort of more transactional one-off study. So it's like soft touch. You know, we're not, you know, going full sort of kilt or anything. But, you know, a good example would be we are very aware that there are certain parts of the community which aren't represented. And so for Hanukkah this year, our learning assistant Eliana did a project for the 8 nights of Hanukkah where we chose an object from our collection, and we asked 8 different community organizations to take this object, which had a link in some sort of way to them, and to interpret it from their own point of view, to create a video, to talk about that object, and then we put it out over our socials about what that community is. So we invited people like Jewish Women's Aid, who work with women going through domestic violence. They interpret it in their own way. We'd never worked with them before at all. So even though it was transactional, it was like do this one thing, what it has done is opened up a new relationship there. We're like, okay, well, we're thinking now about longer term sort of projects we've got on the horizon, and we know they're there, that we can go back to them. So I think we have brokered some new ones, definitely, and started building those relations, but kept it definitely at that lower key. I think, yeah, anything more than that, and I think Etienne's right, we would have the capacity would have been too much for us. Yeah.
And just really briefly as a follow-up to that, I'd just be interested to know a little bit about the tech support for that, because I think one of the things about working digitally at the moment is if you want to engage community groups, maybe they don't have the tech. Have you been sending out, you know, I don't know, microphones or, you know, things to use for making videos and podcasts or whatever? Is that something you've helped support?
It's a really good question. We haven't sent out any tech stuff to anybody. Most of the partners that we worked with didn't really require, what they actually required help with wasn't so much the recording, because we did that mainly over Zooms and things, but what we did support was basically doing all the back of house stuff. And so we said to them, we'll set everything up, you come on, we'll do the recording, we'll do the editing, we'll do all of that stuff. So really what we're asking to do is prepare the in that example, a reflection on this object and about your organization and something you want to tell the community about and how this connects. We'll do all the technical stuff after that. We do have a setup at the museum, so when it was possible over the summer to invite people in, we could, and we did a few in pre-recorded, you know, to try and get ahead of ourselves. But after that, it was all about tech support from behind the scenes, I suppose.
Okay, it's something quite interesting to me because, you know, within the museums group, obviously I talked to quite a few different museums, and I know some places have either sent out tech because they want to have control over what the end product will be, or some places have just gone, you know, do what you want. We want you to, you know, represent yourselves and, you know, make videos on your phone or whatever, and we'll, whatever the quality of it is, that's absolutely fine. And there's been this kind of interesting dynamic sometimes of handing power completely over, sometimes, you know, finding ways to make sure you've still got some element of control. And it's something we didn't really touch on largely in the discussion about partnership working, is there is this I used to work at the RF Museum, and Maggie Appleton, the chief exec there, has this thing she calls the participatometer, and it's this kind of, thing about how far one way do you hand over control or do you keep full control, and it's quite an interesting sort of guide idea for participation related work. And I think that's something that this has really brought out. There's been this tech divide and also a budget divide in different size museums, and how they've actually approached that speaks a lot to the way they approach partnership working. So anyway, it's something I found quite interesting. I think we've got time for one more question. So this is from Nat. Within the sector, partnerships are often formalized or semi-formalized through SLAs. So basically documents outlining the nature of the relationship. How do you feel like this sits within an agile relationship? So if you've got this kind of set of principles that you're meant to adhere to and an agreement, how does that work if you need to make decisions really quickly and change direction quickly, especially if a pandemic turns up? Fran, what's your thoughts on this?
So I have definitely found maintaining the relationships that are based on these sort of formalized agreements much harder this year than ones that are more about the relationships we have with people, for sure, because the ones that are built on relationships that we've had for long term, we've been building up in a different way. It was just much easier. We could both be honest with each other and say, this enormous thing just happened and we both need to delay, or I've had to furlough X number of there was a much more easygoing relationship about, right, okay, let's just catch up with each other, and taking that much more informal approach. The partnerships we've got in place, we've got one where we actually store another museum's collection, and there was this, that's a very formal partnership, and on the sort of extreme end, and working out contracts and where those things sit, and is everybody happy, and what happens if, and that was a lot more work. So I think, again, it's about thinking about how many of those relationships you can manage. There was one or two of those was it. It's like that's all we could manage based on what we were doing. So I think where it sits within the agile approach, I think, is a really good question. I think for me, you wanted a sort of a relationship built, an informal approach, but there does need to be boundaries. And I think we said right at the beginning that there does need to be some sort of agreement in principle. But I think as the years go on, I'm less inclined to want formal agreements in the way that potentially I did. I think they are potentially narrowing rather than limiting themselves to flexible approaches.
And Etienne, we've got about a minute. So what was your thoughts on that kind of crossover between agile and former?
Sorry, pretty much in agreement, although I think most of the work I'm talking about is much less about kind of very formalized SLAs, but we still do have agreements in place for that work. But I think built into those agreements is a kind of level of flexibility and sort of review points, just even built into those sort of less formal agreements, if you like. So I think at any level of agreement, you can build in some flexibility, but obviously much easier with some of the kind of community partners that we're working with, and I think it's a lot easier to do that than with some of the more formal partnerships. But yeah, we've done so well so far at being able to sort of build them into the agreement, building points where we can then review things and change things.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, that pretty much brings us to the end of the evening. So I just want to say big thank you to Etienne and Fran for their fantastic thoughts and case studies and ideas. I hope everyone's taken a lot away. I've made a lot of notes while I've been listening. I want to say thank you to May and Cheryl from the London Museum Group team who've been running the tech support tonight. Thank you to everyone in the audience. Thank you for your questions. Don't forget to have a look at our Facebook group, our LinkedIn page, our Twitter specifically as well, and subscribe to the London Museums Group as a member. It's completely free membership. You just need to go onto the website and sign up. We will be back hopefully later this year with some more digital events, but hopefully as the year goes on and we get into next year, we'll be able to bring back our public events and get those going again, which will be fantastic. And I'm looking forward to seeing everyone's faces again. There's a quick in the comments in the chat, there's a link. So if you want to give us any final feedback or anything like that on this webinar and the rest of the series that we've just finished, that would be extremely helpful. But otherwise, thank you very much. Thank you again to our speakers, and thank you everyone. Have a great evening and enjoy the rest of your, I don't know how long, what time you go to bed. I've got kids so early, so enjoy the last hour of your day, I would say. Thanks very much and good evening.